The islands of the Caribbean have changed entirely over the past 5 centuries. Not only did they used to have thriving indigenous populations that have been almost entirely wiped out and replaced, but they also used to be home to an amazing variety of wildlife that has also mostly disappeared. The original indigenous populations of the islands didn't have written languages, so the details of what animals they used to live alongside can be difficult to figure out. When Europeans arrived in the Caribbean just over 500 years ago, the islands were changed forever. But as they made their way through the islands, they also produced the first written history of the people, cultures, and wildlife found on the over 700 islands spread across the sea. In the 18th century, modern science began to record species under a Latin-based taxonomic system, and scientists around the world began to make lists of the different species found in different places. But by this point, it was already too late for many of the wildlife in the Caribbean. As much as 70% of the endemic species on the islands have gone extinct, many of them before they were able to be officially described and classified. And among these lost species is a series of parrots that today are only known from early European writings of the region. In this video, we're looking at 8 disputed species of parrot from the Caribbean. They're disputed because we have no physical evidence of them today, only some rare descriptions of parrots from centuries-old letters and books. To make matters worse, parrots, especially macaws, played an important role in the cultures of the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, as well as those of tropical North and South America. As a result, parrots were moved around between islands and the mainland frequently, traded and gifted, making their origins often incredibly difficult to determine. Did these species that have hardly been mentioned throughout history actually exist? And will their mysteries ever be solved? Welcome back to All About Nature. On my channel, I try to bring nature-related content that's both educational and entertaining. If you enjoy this kind of content, then please consider liking the video, leaving a comment, or even subscribing to the channel. Now let's take a look at the disputed extinct parrots of the Caribbean. The parrots we're looking at in this video were encountered and described primarily by French explorers to the region, and many of the species were described by the same few people. On the island of Guadalupe, we'll look at the lesser Antillean macaw, the Guadalupe Amazon, and the Guadeloupe Parakeet. From Dominica, we'll see the Dominican green and yellow macaw. From Martinique, we'll take a look at the Martinique Amazon and the Martinique Macaw. And finally, from Jamaica, we have the Jamaican Red Macaw and the Red-Headed Macaw. The majority of these species were described in 1905 by an American zoologist named Austin Hobart Clark. Clark was in the Lesser Antilles from 1903 to 1905, researching the lost species of the islands, and he came across a series of sources describing parrots that were unlike any found on the islands today. He began to scientifically describe them based on the descriptions he found. His efforts to name the new species didn't garner much attention until 2 years later, when the zoologist Walter Rothschild published a book that included Clark's parrots. Rothschild was interested in extinction, and he gathered a list of species that had been lost in recent centuries. The book offered descriptions of all the species and included a series of beautifully colored plates. His inclusion of hypothetical taxa garnered some backlash. Due to the lack of credible sources and the complete non-existence of any physical evidence, many scientists felt that the birds should not have been included at all. But the major problem were the sources themselves. The majority of the descriptions of the birds were made by people who had nothing to do with science. There were clergymen, historians, politicians, and sailors. How could we know if the way they wrote about these species was true and accurate, and not a deliberate exaggeration to make a letter to a friend more interesting? These are the parrots. The Lesser Antillean Islands were once home to a large red macaw, The first record of the Lesser Antillean macaw was in 1496 by Spanish bibliographer Ferdinand Columbus. He mentioned seeing chicken-sized parrots on Guadalupe that the locals called guacamayas. 40 years later, a German historian named Johann Huttich also visited Guadalupe, and he described seeing an abundance of red macaws in the forests. In fact, he said that they were like grasshoppers, so abundant that the native people ate them on a regular basis. The first detailed descriptions of the parrots were made in 1654 and 1657 by French botanist Jean-Baptiste Tertre, who also produced several images of the parrots. In 1654, in his work General History of the St. Christophe Islands, Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Others of America, he described it like this. The macaw is the largest of all the parrot tribe. The head, neck, underparts, and back are flame color. The wings are a mixture of yellow, azure, and scarlet. The tail is wholly red and 1.5 feet long. At first, it would seem that he was simply describing a scarlet macaw, which some scientists theorize may be the real identity of the birds in question. But one feature of the parrot seems to set it apart. Scarlet macaws have blue on their tails, while this macaw is said to have a tail that was wholly red. A French clergyman named Jean-Baptiste Labat also wrote about the red parrots of Guadalupe in 1742, and he said, "It is the size of a full-grown fowl. The feathers of the head, neck, back, and underparts are flame color. The wings are a mixture of blue, yellow, and red. The tail, which is from 15 to 20 inches in length, is wholly red. The head and the beak are very large, and it walks gravely. It talks very well, if it is taught when young. Its voice is strong and distinct. It is amiable and kind, and allows itself to be caressed." Again, the all-red tail is mentioned in the description. It's also clear from the description why the birds began to decline. Keeping parrots as pets was becoming popular around the world. Parrots from the Caribbean were the first to be rounded up to be shipped off to live in the homes of the wealthy, from Europe to India to East Asia. And the macaws, famed for their large sizes and beautiful colors, were often the first to be collected, as they made the most impressive pets. By 1760, the Lesser Antillean macaws were already extremely rare. French zoologists at the time noted that the parrots were limited only to the most remote parts of Guadeloupe. The main cause of their decline was hunting, both for food and for the pet trade, though it was also noted that the captive birds of this species were particularly susceptible to getting sick and dying, though it isn't clear from what. In 1765, French naturalist François-Nicolas Martinet released his work Histoire naturelle, and in it is this plate of a parrot that he likely encountered living on an estate in France. The bird in the painting has fully red tail feathers, as well as red mixed in with the yellow feathers of the wings. Both of these features distinguish it from the scarlet macaw and any other living species of macaw, leading some to believe that this is probably a depiction of the lost Lesser Antillean macaw. In fact, it was this plate that led to Clark describing it as its own species in 1905. At the time that this painting was being printed, the wild population was probably on its final leg, likely having been wiped out by the end of the 18th century. Parrot bones have been found in archaeological sites over the last few decades, but none have been successfully connected to a new species of macaw from the island of Guadalupe. So the mystery of whether the bird in question was a subspecies of scarlet macaw, its own species, or something else entirely remains. When the Lesser Antillean macaw was described, it was believed that it ranged across various islands, including Dominica. This is because macaws were known to have existed there, so it was assumed that it must have been the same species as was found on Guadalupe. But in 1908, only 3 years after the Lesser Antillean macaw was described, Clark stumbled on a description of the macaws found on the island of Dominica and concluded that they must have been a different species. The description was found in the book The History of the Island of Dominica, which was written in 1791 by Thomas Atwood, who was a British colonial judge. Atwood wrote, "The macaw is of the parrot kind, but larger than the common parrot, and makes a more disagreeable, harsh noise. They are in great plenty, as are also parrots in this island. Have both of them a delightful green and yellow plumage, with a scarlet-colored fleshy substance from the ears to the root of the bill, of which color is likewise the chief feathers of their wings and tails. The macaws cannot be taught to articulate words, but the parrots of this country may, by taking pains with them when caught young. The flesh of both is eat, but being very fat, it wastes in roasting, and eats dry and insipid, for which reason they are chiefly used to make soup of, which is accounted very nutritive." His description is entirely different from the red macaws of Guadalupe, so the species was described by Clark as Ara atwoodi, and proposed to be a new species. But no physical evidence of a species of macaw on the island of Dominica has ever surfaced, and this is the only written account of the species. If it did exist, it likely went extinct within a few decades of Atwood's description being made, and just like the lesser Antillean macaw, it would have been wiped out by hunting for both the pet trade and for food. Looking back at Dutertre's description of the animals of Guadalupe, we see that the lesser Antillean macaw isn't the only parrot shown. If we look at this depiction, we have what some scientists today believe to be the now extinct Guadalupe Amazon. Just like the macaw, the Amazon was mentioned in writings by both Dutertre in 1654 and Labat in 1742. Dutertre wrote, "The parrot of Guadalupe is almost as large as a fowl. The beak and the eye are bordered with carnation. All the feathers of the head, neck, and underparts are of a violet color, mixed with a little green and black, and changeable like the throat of a pigeon. All the upper part of the back is brownish green. The long quills are black, the others yellow, green, and red, and it has on the wing coverts 2 rosettes of rose color." A century later, Labat wrote, "The parrots of these islands are distinguishable from those of the mainland of Guinea by their different plumage. Those of Guadalupe are a little smaller than the macaws. The head, neck, and underparts are slaty, with a few green and black feathers. The back is wholly green, the wings green, yellow, and red." Initially described as the violet macaw in 1905, it was decided that the parrot was more likely an Amazon, and it was given the scientific name Amazona violacea. It was apparently extremely rare or already extinct by the end of the 18th century, when French natural historian Comte de Buffon made note of it in 1779. He wrote, "We have never seen this parrot, and it is not found in Cayenne. It is even very rare in Guadalupe today, for none of the inhabitants of that island have given us any information concerning it. But that is not extraordinary, for since the islands have been inhabited, the number of parrots has greatly diminished." And Dutertre remarks in particular of this one that the French colonists wage a terrible war on it in the season when it is especially fat and succulent. Apparently, French colonizers and the people that they had enslaved regularly captured and consumed the birds, to the point where they were entirely eliminated from Guadalupe. But not all scientists believe it was a unique species. Some think that it was a subspecies, or the same as the extant imperial Amazon, which today only inhabits the island of Dominica. It's critically endangered, with only about 50 wild birds surviving in the wild. Unlike the Guadalupe Amazon, the living imperial Amazon isn't hunted for food. Rather, it faces threats from deforestation, the illegal pet trade, introduced species, and increased hurricane activity in the region, which has destroyed much of their remaining habitat. The final species of parrot depicted by Duterte on the island of Guadalupe was the much smaller Guadeloupe Parakeet. It also has almost no record of having existed apart from descriptions by Duterte and Labat. In 1779, Labat described it like this: "Those of Guadalupe are about the size of a blackbird, entirely green except a few small red feathers, which they have on their head. Their bill is white, and they are very gentle, loving, and learn to speak easily." Again, not everyone is convinced that parakeets once called Guadalupe home. No physical evidence of the birds exists. Those who are skeptical primarily believe that the parakeets that were seen on Guadalupe were actually Cuban parakeets that had been taken to Guadalupe as pets and released, establishing a feral population that has since been eradicated. But the main problem with this theory is that Labat was careful to describe the placement of the red feathers. Cuban parakeets have sporadic red feathers around the head and chest, with obvious red patches on the wings, while Labat specifically mentioned red feathers only on the head. And clearly, he had observed the birds closely, as he knew that they made gentle and affectionate pets. If the species did exist, it was likely extinct by 1800, just like the other parrots on the island, and it was probably primarily exploited for the pet trade. South of the island of Dominica is the island of Martinique, which has a species of disputed parrot that's very similar to the Guadalupe Amazon, which was said to live north of Dominica. Again, this description comes from Jean-Baptiste Labat, who described it in 1742 in his work New Voyage to the Islands of America. He was writing about the different Amazon parrots of the islands of the Lesser Antilles when he mentioned a distinct species on the island of Martinique. Those of Dominica have some red feathers on the wings, under the throat, and in the tail. All the rest is green. Those of Martinique have the same plumage as the last mentioned, but the top of the head is slate color with a small amount of red. Labat notes that the species was quite similar to the Amazons of nearby islands, with the distinguishing feature being more gray on the head with a bit of red. Again, those who doubt this account believe that the bird was more likely red-necked Amazons, which are still extant on the island of Dominica. The small differences in coloration could be that it was a distinct subspecies, but others disagree. They feel that the differences are marked enough to merit the Martinique Amazon being classified as its own species. The last record of the Martinique Amazon is from 1722, as the entire island was cleared for agriculture soon after, wiping out countless species of birds. Martinique wasn't only said to be home to a species of Amazon. There are also 2 written reports of a macaw being found on the island. In the 1630s, the French historian Jacques Bouton described a species of macaw from Martinique like this: "The macaws are 2 or 3 times as large as the other parrots and have a plumage much different in color. Those that I have seen have their plumage blue and orange-yellow. They also learn to talk and have a good body." In 1658, French pastor Charles de Rochefort also wrote of a blue and yellow macaw on the island. Among them are some which have the head, the upper side of the neck, and the back of a satiny sky blue, the underside of the neck, the belly, and undersurface of the wings yellow, and the tail entirely red. His description is slightly different, as he adds that the macaw has a red tail, but otherwise it's practically the same. But these are the only 2 mentions of the bird found anywhere. Some scientists believe that the bird in question was most likely blue and yellow macaws from the mainland. Species were moved between the islands and the mainland regularly, and in this case, it is possible that there may have been a feral population of blue and yellow macaws on the island of Martinique. But this doesn't work, at least with Bouton's description, as he seems to say that the underparts were more orange and yellow. It also doesn't work with Rochefort's description, because blue and yellow macaws do not have a red tail. This depiction of the species was made in 1907 for Rothschild's book on extinct birds, and is based off of Bouton's description. And this one was made the same year based off of Rochefort's description. The identity of the birds described in the 17th century from the island of Martinique may never be known. Moving west, the island of Jamaica is one of the larger islands of the Caribbean and is still home to 3 native species of parrot: the black-billed parrot, yellow-billed parrot, and the olive-throated parakeet. But it used to have at least 1, possibly 2 more species whose identity is disputed. In 1847, English naturalist Philip Henry Gosse published a description of a new species of macaw from the island of Jamaica, which he called the Jamaican Red Macaw. He got the description from a friend named Dr. Robertson, who saw the bird taxidermied. Apparently, the parrot had been shot in 1765, and Dr. Robertson based his description off the decades-old stuffed parrot that he observed. He wrote, "Basal half of upper mandible black, apical half ash-colored, lower mandible black, tip only ash-colored, forehead, crown, and back of neck bright yellow, sides of face, around eyes, anterior and lateral parts of the neck and back a fine scarlet, wing coverts and breast deep sanguine red, winglet and primaries an elegant light blue. The legs and feet are said to have been black, the tail red and yellow intermixed." Dr. Robertson had to guess a little at the colors of the beak and feet because birds, once deceased, lose the original coloration on those parts of their bodies. According to Gosse, Dr. Robertson claimed to have never seen a parrot like it, and claimed that it was distinct from the similar Cuban macaw, which is also extinct today, though not disputed. Gosse gave it the Latin name Ara gossei, but skeptics claim that lack of any other specimen or record of the species on the island would suggest that it was either an escaped Cuban macaw, or that perhaps the Cuban macaw ranged to Jamaica at some point. The taxidermied specimen was lost, so no further analysis has ever been done. Jamaica had rumors of one other species of macaw, known as the Red-Headed Macaw. It is also known from a single description that, like the Jamaican Red Macaw, was sent to Philip Henry Gosse, this time from a man named Mr. Hill. Head red, neck, shoulders, and underparts of a light and lively green, the greater wing coverts and quills blue, and the tail scarlet and blue on the upper surface, with the underplumage both of wings and tail a mass of intense orange-yellow. The specimen here described was procured in the mountains of Trelawney and St. Anne's by Mr. White, proprietor of the Oxford estate. If the species did exist, it was probably already limited to a smaller range when Europeans arrived, and would have probably been hunted to extinction by the beginning of the 19th century. And that's it for today's video. What do you think? Are any of these species credible? For me personally, the idea of the islands of the Caribbean flourishing with unique parrots at one point in the not-too-distant past makes me mourn for the biodiversity we've lost in the last 500 years, especially due to human greed and carelessness. I need to say a special thanks to my patrons, whose ongoing support allows me to make videos weekly. If you want to join us on Patreon, check out the link in the video description below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.